The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
You are back in the House of Mystery, and I'm Al Warren. Mr. Michael Butterfield has dropped in between his Hollywood career.
Hi, Al.
Yes, sorry I missed the History Mysteries.
Yes, unfortunately, you were you had COVID. So yeah,
COVID.
Did you miss out? I'm sorry I didn't get to see you there.
Yeah, 3 weeks of COVID.
It went well. It was a good experience.
Well, it'll be exciting, but when will it come out? Next year, probably, I guess.
I guess, the standard cycle is usually, doing these things for the next coming season. But, seasons are different now with streaming and everything. So yeah, don't worry. I'll be sure to let you know when it's on. So
I'll be sure to watch it.
I think it'll be good. We'll see.
We'll find out. Well, speaking of good, we have got a star today, Mr. Hank Schwaeble. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Hank, I have to say, how does one get into this type of writing?
Pretty traumatic childhood is probably the best way to start.
Yeah, I was going to say, so what happened that was so bad that you start writing about this kind of...
That's the funny thing. I really don't have any sort of triggering event or events or really trauma. I came from your typical broken home situation actually a couple times, but I didn't feel particularly traumatized by it. I had a pretty happy childhood, but I was always fascinated in the macabre, the scary, monster movies, things like that when I was a kid. A lot of it may have been due to my stepfather taking me to completely inappropriate movies when I was like 6, 7 years old.
Yeah, like what kind of movies are you talking about?
I remember, I think The House That Dripped Blood. I was like 5 years old or something like that. And
you see Peter Cushing's head on a platter.
Yeah, right. I have this, if it was that movie, I have this very vivid memory of a scene where I'm sitting in the theater, and it's this giant screen and this woman chops the head off a rat and then picks it up by its whisker and eats the head. And I was having a hard time as a 5-year-old trying to process, why would she be doing this?
Yeah.
It exactly makes sense.
Yeah.
But they were scary, but it sort of desensitized me to, the fright. But at the same time, it also created an intrigue because from an early age, those formative years, was exposed to that kind of thing. And that's a precocious kid. And I really followed those plots, and I was always fascinated about the story behind what was going on, like the legend or the rules of the particular monster or curse, or those always interested me, and that really stuck with me. Plus, I had really enjoyed reading Edgar Allan Poe when I was a kid, and it just so happens that my interest, with horror movies was married to an early exposure to Poe in school. And the combination of those things, really set me probably on that path more than anything else. Even though I didn't know it at the time, I didn't really start writing other than dabbling seriously until right after law school. So it was a long period where I was just a consumer.
Were little animals missing in your neighborhood when you were a kid? Anything like that?
No, I'm happy to say that I did not rate on the scale sociopathy at all. So I was able to fool that test really well. No, I was a pretty normal kid. I was very into sports. I don't think I was particularly geeky or anything like that in school, but I hit it well. I was really interested in horror movies and horror literature and reading, but I was pretty well rounded too.
That's what I find fascinating in a sense, because you're kind of you're the all around guy, University of Florida, law school, Air Force officer. Like, you've got all this stuff. Like, you are the American Dream.
Yeah, I was always a pretty all-American kid, apple pie and baseball. But I just liked horror movies, and I liked horror stories. And I read a lot as a kid, and I really devoured comic books. And comic books probably also had a large role in shaping, my tastes, and comic books, particularly Marvel comics that I read, they often had a bit of a horror wisp to them, and it all fed into what I considered to be interesting and entertaining and fun, and that never left. Through college, I was still a big horror movie buff, and I would read horror novels. Interestingly, the older I got, the less horror I read, and the more crime fiction I started reading. Thrillers, crime thrillers, noir. Now, I still like horror, but I don't just exclusively dine on that kind of fare. I probably, the majority of my reading is taken up by mystery, noir, crime thrillers, things like that. I still read horror, particularly horror short stories, but I'm a little more broad in my reading these days than I was back as a kid.
Well, noir is kind of, at least for me, it's been addictive.
I love noir.
Yeah.
And, it all feeds at the same trough in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Horror and noir. It's exploring the dark side. And crime and mysteries tend to explore the dark side in other people. Noir sort of explores the dark side in all of us.
Yeah.
And, horror explores the dark side with more of a what if. What if? What would this bring out in people? At least the good horror to me. It's really about us. It's not about the monster. It's not about, the vampire, the werewolf, or the curse, or the slasher. Really, it's about us and our reactions to it and what scares us. And it's an exploration of what we do when we're confronted with that kind of thing.
Yeah, and noir, I think, especially when it's attached to horror or crime stuff, it like you say, it's like a dark window into human beings that doesn't allow you to hide behind all the window dressing of a lot of other kinds of stories. Yeah,
it strips us bare a little bit, and I see a lot of potential there, which is why I often, kind of wed the two, noir and even crime with horror into my stories, because there's that long-standing link between you do bad things and bad things happen, and it's exploring that aspect, because we all have a dark side. Some of us control it better than others, but literature in general is an exploration of what it means to be human. What does it mean to have a life here? What is the meaning of life, you could say? And we do that through character studies and raising big questions. And what I like about horror and noir is that they raise questions like that. It's just they raise dark questions, and that causes a lot of people to shy away from it. But I would argue that horror has as good, if not better, a pedigree in literature than any genre. I mean, if you look back, you could argue the first real story, was horror. You could, Grendel, was a horror story.
Oh, yeah.
The Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you read the Odyssey, it's an adventure horror story, but I don't see how you could say it isn't horror with all the monsters that are involved. So it really is the stuff that goes right to the core of who we are historically. There's a long tradition, and in Western literature, you've got iconic works, from Mary Shelley, through Stoker, of course, and then an explosion of it in the 20th century. But I think that horror got a bad rap because of movies. And the movies tended to be geared toward teenagers.
Yeah.
And so they focused a little more on the prurient, and titillation and jump scares and gross outs. And people just started over the long haul associating that with horror in general. And so if that's what people think of when they think of horror, that's what they're going to think of when they think of horror literature. But it really does a disservice because, not just to horror, but to book lovers everywhere, because they're missing out on some great pieces of literature.
Oh yeah.
Dracula, for example, is extremely well written as a novel. It's epistolary, it means in the form of letters and journal entries, but it's very, very well structured, and the prose is exquisite. You have to make a few allowances for the time period, but not many. And some of Poe's best stuff, the prose for the 1840s, is absolutely stunning to me. Not just the actual sentence structures, but the way he presents a scene is so modern.
I think that's one of the reasons why he's influenced so many people, especially early on in their lives.
Yes, well, we have the French to thank for that, because they sort of resurrected him. He would have been, I think, pretty forgotten had he not been discovered by some French scholars who really were fans of his use of symbolism and things like that, and taught it a lot. And it kind of revived him, and he became of academic interest in the U.S. too. And we're fortunate for that, because he really was extraordinary. He invented basically the modern horror story and the modern detective story.
Yeah.
How's that for a career?
Well, that brings up an interesting question I wanted to ask you. You said that you had, read less horror and more crime and other things like that. And I'm wondering if you're a little bit like I am, in the sense that I grew up, reading a lot of horror and watching horror movies and stuff. And then at a certain point, my interest changed more to crime and true crime stories. And I'm wondering if that's because that's real horror.
I'm sure that has a lot to do with it, because you start, as you get older and more mature, you start wanting to focus a little more of your passive investigations, we'll call it, when you're reading, into things that are a little more relevant to your life, and crime obviously is. Part of it is also due to there is an abundance of good crime fiction out there. A lot of good mysteries, and not so much noir, honestly. Look, I love noir. It's not as ubiquitous as mysteries and other crime fiction are. But I have to say that when horror is good, it's awesome. When horror is bad, it's awful. When a crime novel is bad, it's like, eh. When a horror novel is bad, you're like, ugh.
Yeah.
How can I get that part of my life back? But it's a big swing or miss kind of thing. And so, I have a lot of writers that are go-to in horror. I won't name them because I don't want to exclude anybody, but, I really enjoy any kind of literature that it's got very strong characterization, polished, fluid prose, and in a gripping premise or plot. And so I'm not really going to limit it to genre. I read a lot of classics too. I try to kind of force myself, not because I don't want to, but because they're not front and center. They're not the newest, shiniest thing. So I have to go back and figure out what I have not read, and which is not too hard, but and go find those things and pull them up and be disciplined that way to make sure that I don't just give into recency bias in my tastes.
Well, that's very interesting. I'm also curious, did you read a lot of those Alfred Hitchcock short stories when you were young?
I won't say I read a lot of them, but I certainly read some of them, yes. And I didn't have just access to everything, as a kid that way. I had access to comic books, let me tell you. There was a comic book store a few blocks away, not even a comic book store, it was a convenience store, or what would they call it, like a pharmacy, I guess, that had the old-fashioned counter with the soda fountain and stuff. And they sold comic books, and I really, really indulged in that because it was close by, and my stepfather wouldn't mind if I got comics, and he would pick them up for me all the time. And so I was awash in comic books. So I read a lot of comic books, and I would read then whatever I could find around the house. And fortunately, my parents, while they weren't, the most learned people, they did have lots of paperbacks lying around, and I would grab them and read them. I remember I read Jaws when I was like in the first grade.
Oh my God.
Something like that. Maybe the second grade. Might have been the second grade. Somewhere in there. It was ridiculous, and I shouldn't have been reading it. And, I still remember, being that young reading it, that, I understood pretty much all of it, or at least thought I did. But one part where they were talking about one character being bisexual, and they referred to him as AC/DC, and I just couldn't quite understand what they were saying when I was like 7 years old, or 8 years old, whatever I was. I couldn't quite get it, and that's why they have parental guidance suggestions on things.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff for the listeners. There's a lot of stuff in the book Jaws that is not in the movie.
Oh yeah, no, it's much different. Much different than
there's an affair between Brody's wife and Hooper, and the mob being involved.
Yes, plus far less of a climactic ending. The climax was a lot less satisfying than the movie.
Yeah.
But he wasn't really building for that kind of a climax.
No.
It was more of just what the characters were going through.
Now I'm curious though. You said that you read comic books. I know you said Marvel, but did you also read like horror comics back then? Because I was addicted to
and those frightened me.
Yes.
Now by the time I got to be a teenager, I'd have to say really nothing could frighten me anymore because I'd been so exposed. I can tell when something's scary, but it's really hard for something to scare me. I don't remember the last time I was actually scared, at a movie. But those, as a kid, I remember distinctly, even though I was getting quite jaded, by the time I was like 8, years old, those horror comics scared me because they had these really creepy covers.
Yeah, yeah.
And, unlike a movie, you couldn't turn it off. And so my stepfather would bring me comics, and he would go to a comic book store with me, and he would not only buy modern horror comics, but, I'd try to convince him to let me buy an old Spider-Man here and there, things like that. And, he would pick up some of those old EC comics.
Oh God, yeah.
And he would read them. He would buy the old ones, comic collecting back then was not as expensive as it is now, but he would spend a few bucks and get an old 1950s EC comic or something, or a few of them, because he remembered from when he was a kid. And he would get them and read them, and then he would just throw them into my room. I'd see them laying on my bed, so I could have them. And I remember some of those covers just creeped the hell out of me. And when I put them away in my drawer, I had several drawers dedicated to just comic books. I would be laying in bed just thinking of them in that drawer.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like books where the words just didn't seem that way to me, the way those depictions on the comic book covers did.
Oh yeah. Well, so much of that was about just the visually striking. I mean, there's
it was
the perfect build up to watching something like The House That Dripped Blood. That's very influenced by EC Comics.
Yes. And like I said, though, movies by then didn't tend to scare me that much. No, I'm sure I was scared at the time. Looking back, it didn't seem. But boy, when I remember those comics, I still can get that feeling just thinking about it. And they just creeped me out. And so yes, I did. There was weird. It wasn't Weird Tales. It was Weird Ghosts was something from DC, if I recall.
Yeah.
And then all the EC ones. Marvel had a few too. Marvel though was so into superheroes that even some of their monster comics are all superhero-ish.
Yeah.
So the Dracula, Frankenstein, and Werewolf by Night comics, which I had all of. I still do. I still got lots of them. I have Dracula #1, Werewolf by Night #1, plus the Marvel Spotlight, that had the first appearance of Werewolf by Night, and Frankenstein monster. I guess it was called the Monster of Frankenstein comic, #1 too. I've got all those. I love them, but they weren't quite like those old EC comics.
No, that's a very different kind of thing. It's like most people think about that as like Creep Show and
Creep Show
and level.
right, Tales from the Crypt and things like that. Those were the old EC ones. I was trying to think of the more 1970s-ish ones that were coming out when I was a kid.
So a lot of those are getting issued in great hardback anthology editions now.
Yeah, those compendiums or whatever they call them. Those are great. If you want to read them, that's definitely the way to go. But yeah, they were, the stories, looking back when I read the stories, they were a bit schlocky. They tended to be. But as a little kid, it was the visuals that stood out and, the graphic depictions that they'd have for the stories. So you didn't really pay much attention.
Lots of skeletons walking around.
Yeah, with the disembowelments, and eyes being pulled out, and, lots of decapitations, and, lots of things involving edged weapons. It was great to be a kid back then, and have all those different influences. When I look back now, because I'm sure it created who I am, it didn't damage me as far as I can tell. It's not that I'm aware of, but it certainly created that kind of interest. And I'm sure that's why I'm interested in noir too, in crime, because they're so closely linked in so many ways, ways that people don't really think about.
Yeah, and I'm curious now too. You said you turned out okay, and it sounds like you're okay. But is there a part of you that enjoys scaring people now with your own writing?
Well, sure. Now, I'm sure Ted Bundy thought he was okay too. So I'm not sure, my own testimonial is worth much. But do I enjoy scaring people? Well, I'm not going to say I don't enjoy it, but that's honestly not what I set out to do. Yeah. What I really set out to do is entertain people and get them thinking. If they can leave a story I write, and it gets them to think about it, a character or something that was posed, a question posed or a theme, and it's sticking with them, it's lingering. That makes me feel like I've done my job.
Well, and that's part of the
obviously
idea,
I want
right?
To like it.
Is that horror and fantasy is a great vehicle for introducing ideas that people may not want to read about in other genres.
I think it's an absolutely wonderful way to introduce people to ideas because, for one, you can do it stealthily by having such freedom with the subject matter, or I should say, having so many different ways of structuring, the subject matter that you're not as constrained with compared to like crime fiction, where it's grounded in the real world. You throw the supernatural or surreal or fantastic into it, well, that frees you up. That liberates you a lot when it comes to selecting the vehicle for the themes that you're trying to explore. So it's really brimming with potential. Now, I try to temper that because I don't think people are coming to these stories to be tackling the big themes all the time. Yeah. They can go read Dostoevsky if they want to do that. But they want to be entertained, and so the primary thing I just try to keep reminding myself is that, people are reading these things because they want a good story. They want interesting characters. They want to, explore what these characters are going through and interesting situations and be surprised and maybe excited and scared too. They mostly want to enjoy themselves and also get the feel maybe that they're giving their mind a decent workout, that it's not just junk food. But I don't want to sacrifice character or plot or setting for theme. I really don't want to do that because it just then sounds like you're kind of imposing a chore. Yeah. A lesson, and I don't want to do that. I don't want an agenda in there. I don't want it to be preachy. I want to raise questions often, and I want to provoke thought, but I want to do it while I'm first and foremost entertaining the reader. That's my primary goal.
Yeah, and I think it was Stephen King that said something like horror is a rehearsal for your own death. It's a way to confront things that scare you in a safe environment.
That's certainly true for some things, yes. I don't know that holds true for all horror.
Yeah.
But there are certainly stories where it does do that. It makes us confront our own mortality. It makes us confront the big questions of, is there anything else? You know, is what we see and hear and touch, you know, is that all there is? You know, is the material world really what it seems to be, or are there layers? Are there other things that we're not aware of? Are there more things dreamed of? You know, are there more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophies? You know, that's the big question. So I think he's right. I'm not sure that definition goes broadly enough, but I certainly wouldn't contradict it.
Yeah. Now, you obviously deal into that sort of other world in your other books, your Jake Hatcher books.
Yes, they're horror, but they're structured as supernatural thrillers, really.
Yeah.
You know, they're adventure horror. I do have some pretty standard horror aspects to them. But horror is hard to sustain for a novel. And I did not want to put readers through anything tedious because, you know, like any commercial fiction, tension is the coin of the realm. That's what gets people to turn the page, is tension. And tension comes primarily, you know, from conflict of some sort, you know, a goal or a peril, and things standing in opposition to it that are trying to be overcome. And the reader wants to resolve the tension. You know, if you're doing your job as a writer, they're turning those pages because you created tension and they want to resolve it. Horror, by its very nature, promises a higher degree of tension. Because if it's the same kind of tension you get from a crime novel, they'd be wondering, well, why am I bothering to read a horror novel?
Yeah.
You know, when I can read a crime novel. You're kind of making a deal with them that you're promising to give them a higher level of tension, whether they realize it or not, consciously. So that can be very difficult to sustain. And if you do sustain it, it can be exhausting for a reader. So I tend to, for novel-length works, tend to structure them as thrillers that have a lot of horror and supernatural aspects to them. Now that might be splitting hairs, but I think you'd find that my novels are a lot different than my short stories, because my short stories are more conventional horror in their approach. Although a lot of people have said that I struck like noir, and that's probably not untrue. I'm very influenced by it, and I do like the noir platform, you know, to introduce horror a lot. So, yes, my novels are horror, but I would say you could probably get a better feel for them going in if you think of them as supernatural thrillers.
And you were saying that it's hard to maintain that level of tension in a novel. Do you think that's one of the reasons why short horror stories are so effective and so popular?
Absolutely. I absolutely think that's why, because you can deliver something in one sitting, and you can raise that tension level, and you can hit them with a scare or something extremely disturbing, and then you can let them think about it. You can let them, you know, let it linger and swim around in their subconscious there. And that's what I think good horror fiction does. And it's hard to do that with a horror novel. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but if you look at any good horror novel, it doesn't have that same kind of constant level of tension that a horror short story does, or it doesn't continue to build. And that might be a better way to look at it too. Whereas in a horror story, you're going to kind of build that tension to a breaking point. And if you're going to do that in a novel, it takes a long time, to get to the end of the novel. So instead, you might have a lot of peaks and valleys, which is not uncommon in a lot of horror novels. But when you do that, you're really then getting it to a more conventional genre structure. And so I I kind of fit it into the genre structure that I'm most comfortable with when it comes to, novel length works, and that is thriller. That's what I kind of naturally gravitate toward. My next novel is coming out next year is a straight thriller. It's not horror at all. It's a novel called Darwin's Laws, which is a straight crime thriller. I didn't really have any difficulty, I think, transitioning to that because I was already very comfortable with that structure. I had done it a number of times already. So, all I had to do was kind of cut out the supernatural stuff and tone down the violence perhaps a little bit.
Yeah.
but other than that, it was the same basic approach to writing the novel.
How do you choose what supernatural or occult sort of elements you're going to use in this, and how far you're going to go with that?
Well, it just goes into what you do when you're, starting a story. And, a lot of people always ask, where do you get your ideas from? And I tell people that creativity is not really inspiration. It's a process. And what you start with, you could call a useful premise. And that's where my stories usually come from. A useful premise is something that just seems like a neat idea. It's not a very well formed out necessarily idea for a story. It's just a premise, like a what if question. Or it could just be a situation. Oh, that would be kind of neat. What if this? What if you saw this? And then you tease it out from there. And so how I decide is where it depends on where I'm starting from. Once in a while, I will look for an idea. And I have a lot of reference material, and I will flip through it just occasionally when I'm looking, you could say for inspiration, and I guess that's fine, but I'm just looking for an idea to start with to then go through that process. One of my stories in Moonless Nocturne is called Psychometrics, divided into 2 words, though. I came up with that story and that title when I found what seemed obscure to me, discipline of what you would call extrasensory perception, I guess, called psychometry. I had never heard of it, which surprised me because I'm one of those guys who always looked at all those paranormal shows, growing up. And if I had ever come across it, I did not remember it. And psychometry was basically the belief that certain people could get impressions and visions from touching objects. So, like they could, for example, pick up a knife from a crime scene, perhaps, and they could get the impression of the person who wielded the knife and reconstruct what happened from the psychic information they received from this object. And it was called psychometry. Well, I'd never heard of it, but I came across a little thing about it in one of my many reference books, and I thought, well, if I hadn't heard of it, there's a pretty good chance a lot of people haven't heard of it. So that means it's fertile territory, for a story that would be somewhat original, in that there probably aren't a lot of stories out there dealing with psychometry. So I took that and I teased on it. I tossed it around in my head for a while, and I came up with the story Psychometrics. And I like it. Interestingly, though, Psychometrics, other than the psychometry, is not really much of a supernatural story. That's more of a crime horror story.
Well, where do your characters come from then? In a situation like that story you just talked about, it sounds like the idea or the theme is first, and then the characters come into it.
Well, it depends. See, in that example, it was, but that's not always the way it works. Sometimes it'll just be an idea for a character. Sometimes it'll be an idea for an opening line. It's that diverse, array of possibilities. When I was writing Psychometrics, when I came across that, I had absolutely no idea, what characters to use. I thought, well, this is a potentially, fruitful mind to go excavating. So I I sat down and had to think about it. So I thought, okay, what would make for an interesting situation involving psychometrics? And it occurred to me that to have somebody who was, a psychometrist, I guess you'd call them, somebody who engaged in that, to be the character would be a little bit on the nose. So I instead came up with the idea of the party who had this supposed gift of psychometry was disabled and non-communicative for the most part and wheelchair bound, except for his sister, who was able to interpret what he was saying and could pass along the information, and was offering his services to police departments and things like that to solve crimes. I just thought that made for a more interesting situation. And it was just like I said, it was a process, but that's not the way the process always goes. Sometimes it's the character that comes to mind first. What if it was a gal who could do this? One of my stories in American Nocturne, the prior collection, started just that very way. It's a story called Cold Service, and the whole idea for that story came from having remembered a newspaper article from many, many, many years earlier, where I think you guys may have even remembered this. Did you ever remember hearing about when this undocumented migrant woman was brought into a hospital, and she was bloated and non-responsive, I think, and they pierced her abdomen to try to relieve pressure, and it released some kind of fumes that knocked everybody out. You remember that?
Forensic Files episode about that, yeah.
Well, I don't even remember what the resolution of that was.
Yeah, they got a lot of other people
I don't even remember what
sick, right?
Yes, they got sick, and at the time, nobody could tell what the heck was going on. Even days later, nobody was certain. I assumed it probably was drug running of some sort. She was a mule, and there was some kind of toxic substance in her being released because the bags broke, or something like that. But I didn't know. But it was the whole mystery of it that I was intrigued by. And so I thought, well, what if one of the people who that happened to, survived it and everybody else didn't, but she, had special abilities after that. And that's how I started the idea for that story and teased it out. And, it was only loosely based, just the background scenario to the character was, loosely based on that incident, where she had been a nurse, this main character. So the point is that I don't ever approach it in one way. It's, inspiration is where you find it, and it's really less inspiration than it is perspiration. It's just work. It's a process. You get better at the process, but you can't sit around and wait for a muse to show up because, they're fickle and, you won't get a lot done that way. You have to learn to control that creative ability, and direct it. Now you prod it, and that's what I do. I will often go looking for things to prod it, but more often than not, the proddings will present themselves. I just got to take advantage of them.
I think you're talking about the case of Gloria Ramirez, who was known as the Toxic Lady. So if people want to look that up to get a little more info on that, that's, I think, what you're talking about.
Must confess, as I was saying, I don't remember what the resolution, if there was one to that, if they ever figured it out.
With your characters, but they seem to be a distant person. Are you not a writer that lives through your character? Like, so many writers will talk about, seeing them, feeling them, hearing them, smelling them. Or they're like a movie or in their brain.
Well, I think of them as real in the sense that I try to imagine a real person. I don't inject myself into them other than in ways that are unavoidable. As the writer, I just try to imagine a real person with the background and circumstances, that I'm positing. And I just try to make them as realistic as I can. Now, the trick in writing is you write a real person, all you're going to get are yawns, because people are boring under a microscope that way when presented on a page. You have to make them a bit larger than life to make up for the fact that they're not three-dimensional flesh and blood characters. You have to make them more real than reality. You have to make them, and by that I mean you have to make them more vivid. And to make them more vivid means you have to make things more pronounced. Their personality, their abilities, their quirks, their foibles, they have to be writ large. Otherwise, it's not going to come across as real. And that's, the weird part of writing. The irony is that the more real you make the character, the less real they'll seem. If you were to just take somebody and write that person absolutely faithfully, diligently to who they actually are, people would say, "Oh, these characters just don't seem real," because they just aren't big enough. They aren't big enough to transcend the page, to rise above the written word and form a real impression on the reader. To form a real impression on the reader, usually you have to make them bigger than reality to make up for the fact that they're coming through a vehicle that naturally reduces them in size. So it's just one of those little tricks. If you go too far, that'll fail also. Then it'll seem like a caricature. But you have to find that happy medium where they come across as real, even though they're real in the reader's mind. And that's what matters, is how the character comes to life in the reader's mind.
How do you manage to write real evil characters in detail? Like,
you got to remember, I think, that evil characters don't really see themselves as evil the way we see themselves. We see them as evil. They see themselves maybe not as virtuous. They may not see themselves as heroic, but they probably see themselves as justified. So you have to take, I believe, that perspective and take it into account. So I think that's where a lot of characterization fails, is when you create somebody who's just, almost a straw man, for readers to supposedly hate. They're just not real, because that's not how people are. Even a serial killer is going to, in his mind, have certain rationalizations for what he does. Now, he may not think of it the way we do, because he may not have any empathy, but he still has concerns. He still has goals. He still has reasons for doing what he does. Doesn't mean they're very well thought out or that they're understandable, but they have to be communicable. You have to make sure that they're not just cardboard cutouts out of central casting, that they're not stock, that they're not caricatures. And so even if you're not conveying all those motivations, you have to know them when you're writing that character. Like Hemingway famously observed, you have to do your characters like an iceberg. As 1/8 of an iceberg is visible above the surface, and 7/8, is hidden beneath the surface of the ocean there. Well, he said your characters, your reader's only going to see that 1/8, but you have to know as a writer that 7/8. That has to be something that's part of your understanding of the character while you're writing that character, because then the reader will sense that mass beneath the surface, just the way we sense the mass of an iceberg when we see that tip. But if you don't know that character and you present just the tip and you don't know the mass beneath it, it's not going to convey. So it's just going to seem like a little chunk of ice floating on the top of the water. He's superficial.
So what do you hope people take away from this book, this newest one of short stories? And I mean that, do you have kind of a subtext ever in your stories, or some sort of meaning, even if it comes out organically, or is this something that is just entertainment?
Well, no, sure. There are some questions. I don't think it's good for a writer to pose answers to readers, because then you're preaching, it's more polemic or propaganda. or lecturing. And I don't think that's why people are reading, and certainly that's not why they'd be reading something like this. But I do think that it's good when you can pose questions and get people wondering about it and considering the ramifications or the implications of things. And there are a number of stories, if not all of them, that I think pose some questions. I say if not all of them because there are some where you probably have to think really hard to come up with what the question would be because they're more there for entertainment. But one of the stories in there called Everything Not Forbidden is sort of a science fiction horror type story set in the not too distant future. And it has to do with the desirability of designing an artificial intelligence to improve society. I don't want to go into it more than that, but the main character is presented with this demonstration of a new technology, and it's giving him a glimpse of what the end result is promised to be if they can bring this new technology online in the way that they are proposing and planning. And it's, some people would like it, but he finds it horrifying. And the question that posing from that is, is this going to happen? And if it's going to happen, if it looks like it's going to happen, are we just going to let it? Is this something we want? Is this the kind of thing that we're heading toward? And if we are, shouldn't we maybe not? And or do we want this kind of thing? So I did pose that one. It's got some heavy questions in the theme to that one. Others are more personal and intimate questions about philosophical questions that you could glean from, reading the characters in there and what they do, whether certain things are justified. What is moral in a certain situation? At what point can you justify taking certain actions? Things like that. So, it's hard to tie them into particular stories because that would mean spoilers. But there are, for the most part, a lot of stories like that. But always, I try to subordinate that kind of thing to just an interesting story, an entertaining and interesting story. But so what do I want to get out of the book? I want people to say, wow, those are really good stories. That's what I want. I really enjoyed those stories. And hopefully they'll say, I really enjoyed those stories and they really made me think. But that part is actually less important to me than enjoying them because that's the threshold requirement is that these stories be enjoyable. Otherwise, you could just read a philosophy textbook or something.
Yeah. Read one of my books.
I will say the most gratifying thing was the introduction to this collection, by the way, is written by F. Paul Wilson, iconic horror writer, bestseller. Oh, yeah. And he doesn't write introductions or things like this very often. If he ever has, I'm not even sure. So I was thrilled that he agreed to do this. And he wouldn't agree at all until he read the stories. And so I was quite relieved when he said, "Oh, these are good. I have no problem doing that." So
that's quite an endorsement.
Yeah, I was thrilled, really. But in his introduction, it was very gratifying to read where he really pointed out that story, Everything Not Forbidden, and said that really disturbed him, that story. And he said that lingers with me, and he said it's lingering with me still when he was writing the introduction. So that is that's a home run to me, especially given the source of that. But if I can get readers, to have that kind of of an endorsement, as you said, or to have it resonate with readers that way.
After they put it down. That's
then I know I've done a good job. But at the very least, I want them to feel like they were glad they read it when they're done with that story. That's, the primary minimal satisfaction that I would get is to make sure that they enjoy them. And I hope they enjoy all of them. And, some people are going to enjoy some more than others. It's almost impossible not to. So that's the hardest thing as a writer when you hear somebody say, "Well, I like this one better than that one," because you always think, "Well, what was wrong with that other one?"
But focus on the good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I really liked it when he wrote this book.
Yeah. But you can't always please everybody. You can't. It's just impossible. With every story, there's no way. All the same, that would just be weird.
Well, if you please F. Paul Wilson, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, I was quite gratified.
Wow. So now, are you doing social media and you doing website? It's like, where do people find you?
Well, anybody who wants to friend me on Facebook, feel free. It's Hank Schwaeble. Send me a friend request, unless I look at your wall and it's just toxic, then I'll probably accept it. I get friend requests from people and I'll go to the wall and it'll be everybody from Party X should be, lined up and shot, and I'm like, I really don't.
Yeah. If they're 100% political BS.
Yeah, I really don't. Yeah. I really wish Facebook would just have an option where you don't see political posts. Like you could just pick the kind of posts. I'd like entertainment, film, books. That's it. That's what I'd like, and then you could filter out that way. That would be great. But unfortunately you can't. So I have to curate a little bit and I don't want, those kind of posts crawling on my wall all the time. So, but for the most part, people who friend me, I accept their friend requests because, that's the purpose for me being on social media. So that's one easy way. And I'll be heading around, doing some signings. They're filling up, but, for people in the Houston area, I'll probably have a few, coming up. Unfortunately, as of airing, I've already done 3 or so in this area, but, on November 5th, I'll be in the Woodlands at Buy the Book. On the 13th, I'll be at the Twig bookstore in San Antonio. And while we're filling up the West Coast swing right now, so far the Poison Pen at 7 o'clock on December 15th, I'll be signing with Weston Oaks and Yvonne Navarro. And then on the 17th, December 17th, I'll be at Dark Delicacies in Burbank. And we're still filling up West Coast spots there. And then I'm planning on Louisiana and Alabama too, but haven't gotten those on the schedule yet. It's hard. I actually got to practice law and things like that to contend with, so I can't be completely pell-mell when it comes to just throwing things on my calendar, unfortunately.
Can't quit your day job.
And no, I can't do that quite yet. But yeah, we'll see. If this becomes a series, then TV series, then yeah, maybe I'll be able to cut back on practicing law.
Now, the book we're talking about, of course, is Moonless Nocturne, and it's tales of dark fantasy and horror noir. And the author, Mr. Hank Schwaeble, thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I enjoy it.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.